On a cold Thursday night in Boston's North End, the candlelight inside Il Faro made everything look softer than it really was, and Cora Donnelly, 27 and running on her second shift, and 4 hours of sleep, still found a way to smile at every table she touched. Because a warm smile was the one thing nobody had ever managed to take from her. She didn't know much about the quiet man at table 6, the one who'd come in every Thursday for 4 months, ordered the same thing, tipped like he was apologizing for something, and watched the room with eyes that never quite warmed. She just knew his name was Mr. Kane, that he liked his wine red and his table in the corner, and that for some reason the loud, careless world always seemed to lower its voice when he was near. What Cora didn't know, what nobody in that crowded, beautiful dining room knew, was that the man she'd been refilling glasses for all those weeks owned the entire street they were standing on, and far more than that, and that he'd been quietly watching the way her hands trembled whenever a man raised his voice too fast. So when the front door slammed open that night, and the familiar face came looking for her when a roomful of strangers went silent and stared at their plates because not one of them dared to step in. None of them understood that the quiet man in the corner was already reaching for his phone, and that within the hour, 400 of his men would surround that restaurant and seal off the entire block. And what he chose to do next would leave everyone in that room too terrified to ever speak of it again. If a story about courage, dignity, and the people who finally refuse to look away is the kind of story you love, do us a favor and hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to hear it tonight, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss what comes next. Now let's head back to that quiet table in the corner, and the night everything changed. The angry man's name was Thaddeus Mercer, and Cora recognized the unsteady sway of his walk even before she could clearly see his face, because she knew the way he threw his weight onto the heels of his shoes whenever he'd had too much to drink, knew it so well that her stomach tightened by reflex before her mind could even understand what was happening. The smell of cheap whiskey spread through the room with him, pressing down over the scent of perfumed candles and red wine, and Cora stood frozen in the aisle with the tray of food still in her hands, her fingers clenched so tightly that her knuckles had gone white. He called her name, not called it but ground it out, that thick, slurred voice carrying through the room as the sound of knives and forks slowly fell silent, and every word that left his mouth felt like a hand shoving against her chest. He told her she was an ungrateful little thing, told her he'd raised her from the time she was a ragged child who wasn't worth a penny, that now she had a job, had money, and still dared to avoid him, dared not to answer his calls, dared to think she was grown enough to forget the man who had given her a roof over her head. Cora tried to lower her voice, tried to keep her words very quiet, very soft, as though if she could make herself small enough, this storm might dissolve on its own. She said this was her workplace, that he should go home, that they would talk later, but her voice shook on the last word, and even she could hear the fear inside it. He laughed, a dry, hollow laugh with no joy in it at all, then slammed his palm down on the nearest table, making a glass of water ripple and an elderly guest flinch back in his chair. Then he said loudly enough for the whole restaurant to hear that she owed him, that she would always owe him, that even the uniform dress she was wearing was something she had because of him, and that he'd come here to take back what belonged to him. Cora felt her face burn hot and then go ice cold. She felt the eyes of dozens of diners turn toward her, and then quickly turn away. And it was that turning away that hurt her more than anything he had said, because in that moment, she understood that this glittering room, filled with well-dressed, polite, elegant people, wasn't going to produce a single person willing to step forward. A couple at the next table bent their heads over the menu as though they'd never seen anything so fascinating. A man dragged his chair a little farther away. A woman pretended to search for something in her purse, and whispers began to rustle around the room like dry leaves. Someone said they should call the manager. Someone else said not to get involved in other people's family matters, but not one foot moved. Delilah, her co-worker standing behind the bar, opened her mouth as though she meant to say something, then stopped when Thad snapped his head around and glared at her. Cora saw Delilah take half a step back too, and she didn't blame her friend. She only felt a familiar loneliness rise in her chest, the loneliness she had carried with her for so many years, that feeling that no matter how many people stood around her, when trouble came, she was still always alone. Thad stepped closer, holding out his open hand in front of her, demanding her tips from the entire evening, and when she didn't move, didn't reach for her wallet, only stood there with her eyes lowered and her trembling shoulders trying to hold on to the last scrap of dignity she had. He leaned in so close that she could smell the sourness of his breath. Then he lowered his voice into a sound meant only for her, cold and sharp, and asked whether she really wanted to make him angry right here, in front of all these decent people. And in that moment, Cora knew that no matter what she did, something terrible was still going to happen. Cora still didn't reach for her wallet, and perhaps it was that stillness, that one moment when she dared not to obey, that set everything off, because Thad's face flushed red and then twisted with a kind of rage she had seen far too many times in the dark apartment of her childhood, and he swung his hand up. The slap cracked through the silent room, sharp and dry, only a small sound. Yet it seemed to shake the whole restaurant, and the weight of the blow made Cora stagger. Her heel caught on the leg of a chair, and she fell onto the cold wooden floor, the tray of food flying from her hands and crashing down with a clatter, shattered porcelain scattering all around her. For 1 second, the whole world seemed to hold its breath, leaving only the pounding of her heart in her ears and the burning sting spreading across her cheek. And Cora lay there, one hand braced against the floor, her hair fallen loose over half her face, trying not to cry, trying not to let anyone see her break apart, because crying in front of him had always made everything worse. Giancarlo, the man everyone in the restaurant affectionately called Papa G, rushed out from the kitchen with flour still clinging to his apron, his kind face twisted with fury. He called Cora's name, then turned to Thad, his voice trembling as he told him he had to get out of there right now, that he would call the police. But Thad only turned around, puffed up his large body, and asked what that old Italian man thought he was going to do. He asked whether he knew what happened to a small restaurant, when people liked sticking their noses into other families' business. And Papa G, a man who had lived decently all his life but was also old enough to know fear, stopped short with his hands clenched, standing there helplessly on the thin line between courage and terror. And that hesitation pierced Cora's heart more sharply than the slap itself. Presley, the new kitchen assistant in his early 20s, appeared in the kitchen doorway with a slicing knife still in his hand, his whole body rigid as though he were about to rush forward. But Thad caught his eye and only gave a cold little laugh, asking whether the kid was planning to play hero. And Presley, with all his youth and all his goodness, still stayed exactly where he was, his hand gripping the knife until it turned white while his feet seemed nailed to the floor. Cora saw in his eyes the shame of someone who wanted to do the right thing, but couldn't make himself move. And she wanted to tell him it was all right, that she didn't blame him, but she couldn't get a single word out. And the diners, dozens of people in expensive suits and silk dresses, all lowered their heads, looking at their plates, looking at their wine glasses, looking at their hands, looking anywhere as long as they didn't have to look at the girl lying on the floor, as though if they didn't see it, then none of this truly existed, as though their politeness were a curtain they could pull closed, so they wouldn't have to become involved in the pain of a waitress they didn't even know. One man gave his companion a quiet signal to stand up and leave with him. A woman pulled her shawl higher over her shoulders as though she had suddenly grown cold. Not one person made a phone call. Not one person spoke up. And that silence, thick, heavy, cowardly, became the cruelest thing in the entire room, crueler even than Thad's hand. Lying there among the broken pieces of porcelain, Cora looked up at the sea of faces turning away from her, and a cold thought moved through her mind, that this was the truth about the world, that people could sit less than 3 feet from your pain and still choose not to look, and she had almost accepted it, had almost lowered her head and pushed herself up alone the way she always had, until she heard a very soft sound from the back corner of the room, the sound of a glass being set down on a wooden table, gentle but decisive, a sound that didn't belong to fear, and somehow it made the entire room fall silent in an entirely different way. The man at table number 6 rose to his feet without haste, without a single wasted movement. He folded his napkin and set it neatly beside his plate, as though he had just finished a peaceful dinner, then pushed his chair back, with the faintest scrape, against the wooden floor, and it was precisely that unhurried calm that drew every eye in the room toward him, because in a room shrinking into itself with fear, a person who could move with such composure suddenly became more striking than any shout ever could. He stepped out into the aisle, tall and straight in a dark, perfectly tailored suit, and each footstep landed with steady measure, neither fast nor slow, like a count only he knew the ending to. And from the floor Cora looked up as he came toward her, the quiet regular customer she poured wine for every Thursday night, and for the first time in 4 months, she saw that his eyes no longer held that distant, indifferent look they always had before. Those eyes, The same eyes she had always thought were as cold as the surface of a frozen winter lake, now held something moving beneath the ice. A dim and dangerous light, not the reckless anger of Thad, but something far more frightening, a deep composure. The kind of composure possessed by a man who had never needed to raise his voice to get what he wanted. He stopped between Cora and Thad, not looking down at her right away, but keeping his gaze fixed on the large man standing there. And when he spoke, his voice was low and very quiet, almost gentle, a kind of softness that forced people to hold their breath in order to hear. And he said that he believed this gentleman had just struck a woman to the ground on the floor of this restaurant. Thad, still thick with liquor and the violent swagger that hadn't yet left him, turned and snarled for him to get lost and mind his own business, said this was a family matter. But the moment his eyes truly met the other man's, something in Thad's voice faltered for half a beat, because no matter how drunk a man may be, there is still some ancient instinct inside him that warns him when he is standing in front of something truly dangerous. And that instinct inside Thad was screaming now. The man didn't answer at once. He merely tilted his head slightly and looked down at Cora, still seated among the shattered porcelain, and in the instant his gaze touched her, the ice melted away completely, revealing something she had never expected to see there, not pity, but something almost like restrained tenderness. Then he extended his hand, palm up, silently inviting her to stand, and it was the first hand anyone had offered her through that entire terrible evening. Cora hesitated, then placed her trembling fingers into his palm, and he lifted her gently but firmly, without the slightest hurry. And once she was standing steadily again, he calmly removed his suit jacket and draped it over her shaking shoulders, a quiet gesture that, in a room crowded with people too afraid to move, rang out like a declaration. Only then did he turn back to look at Thad, and this time when he spoke, his voice was still as soft as before, yet there was something beneath it that sent a chill through the entire room, and he asked whether Thad knew where exactly he had just done such a thing, asked it like a real question, patient, almost curious, and Thad opened his mouth to shoot back an answer, but no words came out, because the man had already leisurely taken his phone from inside his jacket, and he never once looked away from Thad while his finger moved across the screen, and that calm deliberation was more terrifying than any threat could have been, and Cora stood there wrapped in the jacket, still warm from his body, feeling for the first time in many years that the ground beneath her feet had begun, ever so slightly, to shift. He lifted the phone to his ear and waited. After only one ring, the person on the other end answered, and he spoke exactly one sentence into it, his voice still low, and even as before. He told Rowan to come to him, right now, then folded the phone shut and slipped it back into the inside pocket of his jacket, so simply that anyone who wasn't paying attention might have thought he had just called to order a ride home. But Cora, standing close beside him in the jacket that still carried the scent of sandalwood and something expensive, felt the change in the air before she even understood why, because the name Rowan had been spoken with a cold familiarity, with the kind of command that didn't require him to raise his voice. Not a single extra word, not one explanation, as though he knew with absolute certainty that the moment he said it, it would become true. Thad let out a laugh, a thin, forced sound, meant to show that he was still in control of the situation, and he asked mockingly who the other man had just called. A lawyer? The police? Then swept his hand toward the room full of diners, sitting frozen in place, and said that nobody here had seen anything. Nobody would dare testify for her, and it was the bitter truth Cora herself had just tasted. But the man only looked at Thad with the patient expression of someone watching a small animal that didn't yet know it had wandered into a trap. He didn't bother answering the mockery. He merely glanced at the watch on his wrist, a brief glance, yet heavy with meaning, as though he were counting down to something only he knew about, and that small gesture was enough to make the smile on Thad's mouth stiffen, because people only looked at the time that way, when they knew something was already on its way. Papa G was still standing at the kitchen doorway, his eyes moving from the man to Cora and then back again, and on that kind, weathered face appeared a strange expression, no longer the fear from moments before, but the slow-forming shape of recognition, as though he were beginning to understand something about the quiet customer who had sat at table number 6 every Thursday night, something he had never thought to question before, and seeing that expression on the face of a man as seasoned as Papa G made Cora's heart beat faster. Delilah crept out from behind the bar and came closer to Cora, slipping an arm around her shoulders as she whispered to ask whether she was all right. But her eyes stayed fixed on the man in the suit, and Cora could feel Delilah's arm trembling. Not because of Thad anymore, but because of something else. A vague instinct that they were standing at the center of something much larger than one drunken stepfather. Beyond the restaurant's large glass window, the North End street, usually lively at night, suddenly seemed to sink into stillness, yellow light spilling across the stone pavement, and Cora didn't know whether she was imagining it or whether an unusual hush was truly spreading in from the end of the street, the kind of stillness that comes before a storm. The man bent toward her and spoke in a very quiet voice, just loud enough for her alone to hear, telling her not to be afraid anymore, that from this moment forward, no one in this room would be allowed to touch her again, and he didn't say it like comfort. He said it like a fact already decided, something obvious and beyond argument. And it was that absolute certainty in his voice that made Cora feel both strangely safe and chilled all the way down her spine, because she was beginning, dimly, to understand that the man standing beside her wasn't an ordinary customer, and that the short sentence he had just spoken into the phone was about to change everything. The first wave arrived so quietly that at first no one noticed, only sleek black cars gliding one after another into the narrow street and stopping along both sides of the road, one by one, headlights going dark, engines still running smoothly, and through the large glass window Cora saw them appear in sequence like a school of large fish, silently swimming into shallow water. 3 cars, then 6 cars, then so many that she stopped counting, filling the entire stretch of street that was always crowded with parking spaces in the North End. Inside the restaurant, a few diners began to turn and look out, whispers rising and then dying away, and Thad, still standing in the middle of the aisle, turned his head toward the street with a smile that was slowly withering on his lips, because even a drunk man understood that people didn't send an entire line of cars like that merely to make an empty threat. Then the second wave came, and this time it wasn't quiet anymore. The car doors opened almost in the same rhythm, and out stepped men in neatly tailored dark suits, dozens of them. Then more than that. They didn't hurry, didn't shove or crowd, but spread out across the sidewalk with a silent coordination so chilling it raised the skin. One man taking position at the corner, another standing in front of the neighboring shop, others stopping right outside the restaurant's glass window, arms folded across their chests, calm eyes sweeping over everything around them, and within only a few minutes the entire North End street was filled with still figures like statues, placed exactly where they were meant to be. Cora stood rooted to the spot, staring outside, her breath trapped in her chest, because she'd never seen anything like this in her life. The way hundreds of people could move with almost no sound, the cold and absolute order of it, as though the familiar street where she had worked for years had suddenly become the territory of a force she couldn't name. The third wave was the one that drew sharp gasps throughout the room, because from the far end of the street came larger vehicles, and the people stepping down from them wore dark, clean-cut clothing almost like uniforms. They moved in clear formation, dividing themselves to seal off both ends of the street, raising an invisible perimeter through which no one would now enter or leave unless they were allowed, and the yellow streetlights spilling over those figures made everything beyond the glass look like a scene from a film, beautiful in a cold and threatening way. Inside the restaurant, the silence was now completely different from the cowardly silence of moments before. This was the silence of people who had just realized they were standing very close to something far beyond anything they understood. A woman at the table near the window lifted a hand to cover her mouth. A man fumbled for his phone, then put it down again because he didn't know who he should call, and Delilah gripped Cora's hand hard enough to hurt, whispering over and over, asking what was happening, but Cora couldn't answer. She could only turn and look at the man standing beside her, the man who remained calm as though everything unfolding out there was nothing more than rain arriving on schedule, rain he had known was coming all along. He didn't turn to look outside even once. He didn't need to look, because he knew every step in the order he had summoned with a single sentence, and that composure of his, while the entire street was being surrounded by hundreds of people, was what finally made Cora understand just how badly she had misjudged the customer from table number 6. Thad stepped back once, then again, until his back hit the edge of a table, and the face that had been flushed red with liquor and rage was now drained white. His eyes darted around in search of an escape, but every door, every window, now had a figure standing guard, and for the first time that evening, he was the one trembling, while Cora, wrapped in the warm jacket of a stranger who, As it turned out, he was no stranger at all, silently watched the balance of power in the room tilt completely to one side in only a handful of minutes. Papa G threaded his way between the tables and came closer to Cora, gently drawing her back a few steps toward the bar, away from the man's hearing, his calloused hands still trembling as he set them on her shoulders, and he leaned close to her ear and whispered in a hoarse voice, thick with terror, asking whether she knew who the man who had just put his jacket around her really was. Cora shook her head and whispered that he was only Mr. Kane, the regular guest who always sat at table number 6, the quiet man who said little and tipped generously. And when Papa G heard that, he closed his eyes for a moment as though he were praying. Then he told her the full name, Wesley Kane, and he said it so softly it was almost only a breath, as though simply speaking that name aloud was dangerous in itself. At first the name meant nothing to Cora. She only stared at him in confusion. But then Papa G went on. He told her this was the man who owned half this neighborhood, the man whose companies held even some of the most expensive buildings in downtown Boston, through no one knew how many layers of fronts, the man newspapers sometimes mentioned in careful, veiled words before quickly falling silent again. The man, the city police, according to whispers, had never been able to touch even once, and every sentence Papa G spoke made the ground beneath Cora's feet seem to tilt a little more. She slowly turned her head toward the man standing in the middle of the room, the man she had spent the past 4 months casually pouring wine for and asking about the weather, the man she had once pitied for the quiet loneliness he carried every Thursday night. And now she looked at him with entirely different eyes. For the first time, she saw the power radiating from that straight, unmoving stance, saw the way hundreds of people outside were waiting for nothing more than a nod from him, and she understood that the silence she had always mistaken for loneliness was really the stillness of a man who had never had to fight for anything because the whole world had already learned to step aside for him. A chill ran down her spine as the scattered pieces of the past 4 months suddenly locked into place, the way other guests sometimes glanced toward table number 6 and quickly looked away, the way the restaurant manager always personally checked that table before he arrived, the unusually large tips she had once thought were only the generosity of a wealthy, sorrowful man, all of it now carrying a new meaning that made her heart pound. She thought of the hand that had reached out only moments ago to lift her from the floor, the hand that had draped the warm jacket over her shoulders with such strange gentleness, and she didn't know how to reconcile that tender gesture with what Papa G had just told her, how to reconcile the man who had been the only kindness shown to her through an entire night of terror with the man an entire city quietly feared. Papa G tightened his grip on her shoulders, his voice urgent now, telling her she had to be careful, that men like Wesley Kane never did anything without a reason, that the kindness of people like that always came with a price people couldn't always see in advance. And Cora understood that he was worried for her, but she couldn't make herself look away from the man standing in the middle of the room, and as though he sensed her gaze, Wesley Kane turned his head slightly, his eyes finding hers across the crowded distance of the restaurant, and in that moment he said nothing, showed no dramatic expression. He only looked at her, as though he wanted to see how she would react now that she knew the truth, as though he were waiting for the fear, the disgust, or the familiar horror he had always seen in other people's eyes whenever they realized who he was. And Cora realized that now she was the one holding an answer he was waiting for. The restaurant door opened, and a man stepped inside, tall and lean, his neatly cut hair threaded with silver, his eyes sharp as knives, and Cora understood at once that this was Rowan, because the way he stopped exactly 1 step behind Wesley and bowed his head slightly to wait for an order said everything. Wesley didn't turn around. He only said quietly to take this man outside, and in the way he spoke that word outside, there was a weight that chilled Cora to the bone, because she understood that with people like these, taking a man outside in the dark of night, out of sight of witnesses, away from the place where there was light, could mean something very different from what the law allowed. Rowan moved forward, and 2 men in suits from outside came in with him, and Thad began to stammer, all the aggression from earlier now completely gone. He backed into the tables and chairs, his mouth babbling excuses that he hadn't known, that he'd only come to ask for a little money, that this was a misunderstanding, and for the first time Cora saw the man who had haunted her entire childhood shrink in fear, saw him become small and pathetic, in exactly the way he had always made her feel, and some part of her, the part that had endured far too many years, wanted to turn away and let whatever was about to happen simply happen. But then her eyes moved over Papa G, standing pale-faced by the bar, over Presley still gripping the knife with his eyes wide in terror, over Delilah trembling beside her, over the diners holding their breath as they watched, and she thought that if she stayed silent and allowed what was about to unfold, then this restaurant, the only place in years that had ever given her something close to the feeling of home, would forever become the place where blood had been spilled, and Papa G, Presley, Delilah, all of them would have to carry that memory for the rest of their lives. And so, before she could think any further, Cora stepped forward and placed her hand on Wesley's arm, a small gesture. Yet it made the entire room seem to stop breathing, because no one, absolutely no one in his world, dared to touch him that way. And she looked up at him, her voice trembling but clear, and asked him please not to do that here. Wesley turned and looked down at the hand resting on his arm, then up at her face, and in those eyes that had always been so perfectly calm, something passed through that perhaps he hadn't felt in a very long time: astonishment. Because she wasn't begging for Thad, she wasn't saying he deserved forgiveness, and there wasn't the slightest trace of pity in her voice for the man who had struck her to the floor. She was speaking about something else, about this room, about these people, about the fact that she didn't want the people she cared for to witness one more terrible thing on a night that had already held more terror than enough. She went on, her voice steadier now, saying that he wasn't worth Wesley having to put his hands into it, that there were other ways, that she had lived her whole life in fear, and she didn't want this place, didn't want these people, stained by that fear, and she said that if he truly wanted to help her, then please let this be handled in a way she could live with afterward, in a way that wouldn't make her look into Papa G's eyes every day and remember blood. Wesley stared at her in silence for a very long time, long enough for Cora to hear the pounding of her own heart, and she saw something inside him shift, something even he didn't seem to fully understand, because his whole life he was used to people obeying him, fearing him, or using him, and no one had ever stood in the middle of hundreds of his men, taken hold of his arm, and asked him to be kind, not because she was afraid of him, but because she was worried for someone else. Then, very slowly, he lifted his head and gave Rowan a slight signal to stop, only a small lift of his chin, but it was enough for the whole room to understand that the balance had just tilted in a direction no one had expected. And Rowan, after a flicker of surprise crossed his cold face, stepped back half a pace, and Cora stood there, her hand still resting on Wesley's arm, both stunned and unable to believe that the words of an ordinary waitress like her had just made the most powerful man in the room stay his hand. Wesley kept his eyes on Cora's face for another moment before turning to Rowan, and this time his order was entirely different. He said to call the police and to have them bring whatever was necessary, his voice still low and even, but now carrying a new shade Cora had never heard before. Not mercy, but a cold calculation even more frightening than violence, because she understood that he hadn't spared Thad at all. He had simply chosen another way to crush him, a way she had asked for, and he had listened. Rowan nodded and took out his phone, and within only a few minutes, Cora heard the wail of sirens echoing from the end of the street. But what stunned her was the way the ring of people outside quietly parted to make room, the police cars rolling into the street that had been sealed shut just moments earlier, with such smoothness that it felt as though everything had been arranged in advance, as though even the city's own law enforcement, when stepping into that territory, had to move according to a rhythm set by someone else. 2 police officers entered the restaurant, and Cora realized they didn't look surprised by Wesley's presence at all. One of them even inclined his head slightly toward him in a restrained, meaningful greeting before moving toward Thad, and Rowan stepped forward to hand them a thin folder whose contents Cora couldn't know, but from the way the officer flipped through it and nodded, she understood that everything needed to keep Thad there tonight had already been prepared long before she had even understood what was happening. Thad was handcuffed right in the middle of the room, and as the officer read him his rights in that familiar, even voice, his bloodless face shifted into real panic. He twisted toward Cora and shouted that she would regret this, that she couldn't do this to him, that he was the man who had raised her, but his voice was now nothing more than the desperate cry of someone who had just realized he had lost all his power. And Cora stood still and looked at him, not avoiding his eyes the way she had for so many years, but meeting them directly, quietly, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid. When they led Thad toward the door, he was still looking back and babbling threats, but no one in the room was paying attention to him anymore, and the restaurant door closed behind him, cutting off his shouting and leaving behind a strange stillness that filled the room, the stillness of a storm that had just passed. Outside the glass window, Cora watched the North End street slowly return to what it had been, the black cars leaving one by one as quietly as they had arrived, the figures in suits dissolving into the night, the invisible perimeter coming down, and within only a few minutes, the street that had just been packed with people once again looked like an ordinary Italian neighborhood at night, as though everything that had happened had been only a dream from which she had just awakened, except for the jacket still warm around her shoulders and the sting still burning on her cheek. The diners began to rise one after another, still dazed, a few leaving in haste without even waiting for their checks, others simply sitting in silence and staring at one another, and Cora knew that not one of them would tell anyone outside about what had happened tonight, not because they didn't want to, but because they had understood, in the way people understand something without needing it spoken aloud, that some things were best buried in silence. And in the middle of the restaurant, slowly returning to its ordinary breathing, Wesley Kane turned to look at her, and this time there was no longer any searching suspicion in his eyes, only a silent question, as though now that the storm had passed, he wasn't sure whether she would look at him as a savior, or as something she ought to stay very far away from. For the entire week after that, Cora lived in a strange suspended state. By day, she still went to work, still smiled at customers, still carried trays of steaming food through the dining room, but her mind kept drifting back to that night, to the hand that had reached out and lifted her up, to the hundreds of people who had dissolved into the darkness, and every Thursday night, when that familiar hour drew near, she felt her heart beat faster without knowing whether it was because of fear or because of something else she didn't yet dare to name. She told herself that he wouldn't come back, that a man like Wesley Kane must have already forgotten the waitress he had happened to help, that his life surely held too many enormous things for him to concern himself with a small restaurant in the North End. But then, on that very Thursday night, at exactly the familiar hour, the restaurant door opened, and he stepped inside, still in a dark suit, still walking with that unhurried stride, and he went straight to table number 6 in the corner, as though nothing had ever happened. The entire kitchen seemed to stop for half a beat. Papa G looked out from the kitchen with worry in his eyes, and Delilah nudged Cora lightly in the ribs, whispering to ask whether she wanted someone else to serve that table. But Cora drew in a deep breath, picked up the bottle of red wine he always drank, and walked over herself. She poured his wine with hands she tried hard to keep steady, and when she set the glass down, she didn't hurry away the way she did with other guests. She lingered for a moment, then quietly thanked him, not with the polite gratitude of a server, but with a real thank you, small and sincere, because that night he had been the only one who stepped forward. Wesley looked up at her, seeming a little surprised that she didn't appear afraid, and he said she didn't need to thank him, that he had only done what the whole room should have done. And in those words Cora heard something bitter, a contempt for the world that had settled deep inside him. So instead of retreating, she asked him a very ordinary question. She asked whether he had eaten anything tonight, or whether, like every other time, he was only going to order wine and sit there watching other people eat. That simple question seemed to make him go still, because perhaps it had been a very long time since anyone had asked him something so harmless and human, since anyone had cared whether he had eaten dinner or not. And he looked at her for a long while before answering that he wasn't hungry, but she only gave a faint smile and said Papa G had just made a new gnocchi dish, that she would bring him a plate, and she said it not as though she were serving a kingpin, but as though she were taking care of a lonely man sitting by himself in the corner of the restaurant. When she returned with the steaming plate of food, he was still sitting there, and this time he gave a slight gesture inviting her to sit in the chair across from him, an invitation she knew she should refuse, a dangerous invitation in every possible sense, because Papa G had warned her, because her own reason was shouting that this man belonged to a world she shouldn't step into. But there was something in his eyes, a loneliness she recognized all too clearly, because she had carried it herself for so many years, that made her pull out the chair and sit down. They spoke very quietly beneath the low murmur of the restaurant, at first about small, stray things, and then Cora noticed that he answered every question she asked with caution, one word at a time, like a man far too used to having anything he said turned against him, and she understood that this guardedness wasn't coldness, but a kind of armor, and the longer they talked, the more clearly she saw that beneath the power that made an entire city fear him was a person who had almost never been treated like an ordinary human being. At the end of the evening, when she rose to return to work, Wesley said something after her that made her stop. He told her she was the first person in many years who had sat at the same table with him, without wanting to ask for anything or fearing him at all, and there was such naked honesty in his voice that Cora didn't know how to answer. She only knew that some invisible boundary had just been crossed in silence. The Thursday nights after that became a habit they both understood, without either of them ever naming it. He still came at the exact same hour, still sat at table number 6, and Cora still gave him the last few minutes of her shift to sit down and talk. And little by little, the guarded armor around him began to crack, not because she pressed him with questions, but because she never pressed at all, because she simply sat there and listened in a way no one had ever listened to him before. One evening, when the restaurant had thinned out and only the soft sound of jazz drifted from the old speaker, Cora asked him why a man who had everything always came here alone, to the same table, at the same hour, and Wesley silently turned the wineglass in his hand for a long time before answering. Then he said perhaps it was because this was the only place in the whole city where people treated him like an ordinary guest, at least until that night. She said nothing, only waited. And as though her silence were a safe, empty space where he could lay down things he had never told anyone, he began to speak, his voice low and even, saying that he had grown up with nothing, that he couldn't remember his father's face, and that his mother had left him at a roadside gas station when he was only 7, telling him to sit still and wait, then never came back. He told it not in the voice of a man asking to be pitied, but in the flat voice of someone who had repeated the story inside his own head for decades, until every feeling in it had been worn smooth. He said that on the first night he curled up in the cold at that gas station, he learned the most important lesson of his life, that no one in this world came to save anyone, that people only turned their faces away the way the whole room had turned away from her that night before. Cora felt her chest tighten, not with pity, because he would have despised pity, but because she recognized a painful truth, that the 7-year-old boy abandoned at a gas station long ago, and the girl lying on the restaurant floor among people who looked away had, in truth, learned the same lesson about loneliness. Except he had chosen a different road, so he would never have to feel powerless again. He went on, saying he had sworn he would never again be that child sitting there waiting for someone who would never come, that he had built everything he had on the cold belief that if the world only respected power, then he would become the most powerful man of all, that he let people fear him, because fear was the only thing he had ever learned how to control, and he said it with no pride at all, but almost with exhaustion, like a man who had climbed to the top of a mountain he had built for himself, only to discover how cold and empty it was up there. She asked him whether, through all those years, he had ever been happy, and he looked at her with a strange expression, as though no one had ever asked him that before. Then he answered honestly that he wasn't sure he still knew what happiness meant, that he had grown used to measuring life by what he owned and by the people who had to fear him, and that it wasn't until he sat watching her pour wine every Thursday night that he dimly remembered there had once been a time when he, too, had longed for simple things he had taught himself to forget. Cora went still, because she understood that she was being handed something precious and dangerous. The truth of a man the whole city knew only how to fear and no one had ever truly seen, and she softly told him that the little boy left behind at the gas station all those years ago hadn't deserved to be abandoned, that the fact no one came to save him was their failure, not his. She saw the hand holding the wineglass tighten slightly, only a small reaction, but enough to reveal that her simple words had touched a place deep inside him that all the years of power and money had never been able to reach. And in that moment, the man who made all of Boston lower its voice whenever his name was spoken suddenly looked no different from that 7-year-old boy who had still been sitting in the cold, waiting all these years. This time, Cora was the one who spoke first, not because he had asked, but because she wanted him to know that she understood, that she wasn't simply sitting there listening to his story as an outsider, and she set down her tray, pulled out the chair across from him, and said plainly that she knew what it felt like to have the whole world turn its back on you too. She didn't circle around the story. She laid out each thing clearly, as though she had been preparing for it for a long time, saying that her mother had died 8 years ago, after a long illness, that the final months of her mother's life in the hospital had left behind a crushing debt she was still paying off, little by little with tips and night shifts stacked one on top of another, that every month she watched that number creep downward so slowly that on some nights she wondered whether she would ever manage to pay it off before she simply wore herself out. She didn't say it in the voice of someone complaining about her life, but with a calm directness, almost with a hidden kind of pride, because she had carried all of it by herself for 8 years without begging anyone for help. And Wesley recognized that immediately, recognized that the woman sitting before him wasn't weak at all. Not the way her trembling figure on the restaurant floor that night might have made someone believe. Then she told him about Thad, and this time her voice dropped a little. She said he had married her mother when she was only 10, that in the early years he had still known how to hide what he was, but the longer it went on, the less he bothered pretending, and the cramped apartment where she had grown up became a place where she learned to predict a man's anger from the sound of his footsteps, from the way a key turned in the lock, from the weight of the silence. She said that after her mother died, she should have been able to leave, but Thad had cleverly held on to papers, to debts in both their names, turning her into a hostage of her own life, and that more than once she had called the police, but he had always been sober enough never to leave marks where people could see them, clever enough to make her look like an unstable daughter making things up in the eyes of outsiders. Wesley listened without interrupting, and Cora noticed his jaw tighten, noticed that familiar, dangerous stillness rising in his eyes again, so she quickly added that she wasn't telling him this so he would go punish anyone else, but only so he would understand why she had asked him to stop that night, because she had lived too long, in a world where violence gave birth to more violence, and she knew too well that Circle never truly set anyone free. She said what she had always longed for wasn't to see Thad suffer, but to live a life where she didn't have to hold her breath every time she heard a door open, and she said perhaps that was also what the 7-year-old boy at the gas station had once longed for, to be safe, to have somewhere to belong without having to pay for it with other people's fear. That sentence made them both fall silent, because in that moment they both realized that two people who seemed to stand at opposite ends of the world, one a man of immense power and the other a waitress buried in debt, had in truth been shaped by the same kind of wound, only by different paths they had chosen in order to survive. He had built an empire so no one would ever dare abandon him again, while she had held on to kindness as a way of proving that the world that had hurt her still hadn't beaten her. And when Cora lifted her eyes and met Wesley's gaze, she saw him looking at her in an entirely new way, not as someone who needed his protection, but as an equal who had just shown him there was another way not to collapse, a way he had never dared to try in all his life. A few days later, Rowan came to the restaurant late in the afternoon, when it hadn't yet filled with customers. He didn't order anything, only sat down at table number 6 to wait for Wesley, and when Wesley walked in, Cora, standing behind the bar, understood at once that this wasn't an ordinary meeting, because Rowan's usually expressionless face carried an unusual gravity, and in his hand was a folder much thicker than the thin file he had handed to the police that night. Wesley gestured for Cora to come closer, a gesture that showed he considered her someone involved, not an outsider who needed to be kept in the dark. And Rowan, after glancing at her for a moment as though to confirm it, opened the folder and began speaking in the even voice of a man accustomed to reporting things no one wanted to hear, saying that the investigation into Thad Mercer had uncovered more than they had expected. He said Cora wasn't the first woman, that over the past 15 years there had been at least 3 others, an ex-wife from before Thad married Cora's mother, a woman he had once lived with for several years in another town, and a former co-worker who had once filed a complaint. And every name Rowan read aloud made Cora's heart feel as though it were being squeezed shut, because she suddenly understood that her pain hadn't been one isolated accident, but one link in a long chain of people who had passed through that man's hands. But the next detail was what made even Wesley narrow his eyes. Rowan lowered his voice and said that the complaint filed by that former co-worker, a report that should have remained in the records, had disappeared inexplicably years ago, not misplaced, but deliberately pulled from the system, as though someone with enough authority or enough money had once made it vanish. And that disappearance was the truly frightening part, because it showed that Thad wasn't only a violent man acting alone, but someone who had once had a way to silence the people who dared speak up. Cora sat down in the nearest chair, her hands laced together on the tabletop, and a tangled storm of emotions rose inside her, both a hot rush of anger as she thought of the other women who had endured the same fear she had, and a senseless kind of guilt that if only she had spoken sooner, more strongly, perhaps someone might have been saved, even though her reason knew perfectly well that her silence all those years had been the product of the machinery of fear he had worked so hard to build. She lifted her eyes to Wesley and said, her voice trembling but firm, that those women deserved to know they weren't alone too, That if their complaint had once been erased by someone's hand, then this time someone had to make sure the opposite happened. That someone had to help their voices keep from being buried all over again. Wesley looked at her for a long time, and Cora recognized something moving in his eyes, because she had just spoken aloud the very thing he had done the opposite of all his life. He was used to using power to make things disappear, to bury them, to control them, while she was asking him to use that same power for the opposite purpose, to drag buried truths back into the light. He turned to Rowan and ordered him to find all three of those women, not to threaten them or buy their silence the way he had once been accustomed to doing, but to let them know that this time would be different, that if they chose to speak, someone would be standing behind them. And Cora watched him give that order with a strange feeling rising in her chest, because she understood that she had just witnessed a man beginning, however faintly, to learn how to use his darkness in service of the light. That evening, after the restaurant had closed and Papa G and the others had gone home, Wesley lingered, and he invited Cora to sit with him at the table on the patio overlooking the North End street, now empty of people, the streetlights casting a yellow glow across the stone pavement damp with dew, and he poured her a glass of wine before saying the thing she could feel he had been weighing for a long time. He said her life was standing at a crossroads, and he wanted her to have the full right to choose, not be pushed into it the way she had been so many times before in her life, and he laid it out clearly, directly, the way he was used to handling everything, without dressing it up and without hiding anything. The first choice, he said, was that he could arrange a completely new life for her. He could erase the hospital debt that had weighed on her shoulders for so many years, could set her up with a new identity in another city, a place where Thad or any ghost from the past would never be able to find her, a place where she could begin again, free, safe, and no longer tied to him in any way. And he said that if that was what she wanted, he would respect it absolutely and would never appear in her life again. Cora went still before such generosity, an offer that for anyone else might have sounded like a dream, the chance to shed every burden in a single night, but she recognized something strained in the way he said the final sentence, as though even he didn't entirely hope she would choose that path, though he was willing to give it to her. Then he spoke of the second choice, and this time his voice was slower, more careful. He said she could choose to stay, but staying meant stepping into his world, and he didn't paint it in pretty colors. He said plainly that it was a world with shadows she would have to learn to live beside, with dangers that being close to him would bring, with things she would witness and might never feel comfortable with, that standing beside a man like him would never be simple or safe. But he also said, and this was the first time Cora saw him struggle to find the words, that if she chose to stay, she would never have to face anything alone again, that he would be there, and he said those three words clumsily, like a man who had never learned how to offer anything without control attached to it, as though even he was startled by his own vulnerability. Cora sat very still for a long time, gently turning the wineglass in her hand in the same way he always did, and inside her was a real struggle, because one part of her, the part worn down after all those years, longed for the simple safety the first choice promised, a quiet life with no black cars and no people dissolving into the dark. But another part of her knew that if she chose to disappear, she would forever be the one running away, and that the man sitting in front of her, with all his darkness, was still the only person who had ever truly seen who she was, and stepped forward for her when the whole world had turned away, and she didn't know whether safety bought by turning her back on that was truly freedom, or only another softer prison. She lifted her eyes to him and said she needed time, that this was the biggest decision of her life, and she didn't want to make it in one night because of emotion. And Wesley nodded, and what surprised her was that he didn't seem impatient or disappointed at all. He only said he would wait as long as she needed, that this time she would be the one to decide the pace of her own life. And that patience, coming from a man who had never had to wait for anything, made Cora's heart tremble in a way she wasn't ready to name. A few weeks passed, and Cora began to feel that her life was slowly settling into a new rhythm. She still hadn't given Wesley an answer, but between them there was a quiet understanding, until one morning she received a call from the prosecutor's office, saying that Thad had been released on bail after his lawyer posted the bond, that while he waited for his court date, he was free on the condition that he come nowhere near her, and though they reassured her that a no-contact order was in place, Cora still felt a familiar coldness crawl along her spine, because she knew better than anyone that a piece of paper had never been strong enough to stop a man like Thad. She considered calling Wesley. He had told her to call him the moment anything unusual happened. but some proud part of her hesitated. She didn't want to run and hide behind his power every time she was afraid. She wanted to believe that the order and the law would do what they were supposed to do, and so she decided to keep living as usual, trying not to let that news steal away the peace she had fought so hard to reclaim. But over the next several days, she kept feeling as though she was being watched. A strange car parked a little too long at the end of the street, a shadow flickering across the road every time she finished her shift. Vague instincts she kept telling herself were only her imagination. Until that fateful Thursday night, when she was the last one to lock up the restaurant because Papa G had to leave early for a family matter. That night, the North End was quieter than usual. The early season cold had thinned the street of people, and just as Cora pulled down the iron gate and locked it, just as she turned to head toward the subway station, a dark figure rushed out from the alley beside the restaurant, and before she could understand what was happening, a hand had clamped hard around her arm. She smelled that familiar, chilling scent of alcohol, and she recognized Thad's face, twisted with hatred, right there beside her own. He hissed through his teeth that she had ruined his life, that because of her he had lost everything, lost his job, lost his dignity, lost his freedom, and that if he had nothing left to lose, then he was going to make her pay. In the sickly yellow glow of the streetlight, Cora saw a flash of steel in his hand, a knife, and for one instant her whole body froze with the primitive fear she had carried since childhood. But then something inside her, something forged through everything she had survived over the past few months, refused to let her stand still and take it like the girl she had once been. She yanked her arm back hard, screamed as loudly as she could, and that sudden resistance stunned Thad for a breath, long enough for her to stumble a few steps backward toward the light of a storefront, still lit at the corner. Her scream tore open the silence of the empty street, and in that chaotic moment she saw a few figures in the distance turn around. But Thad, reckless now with the madness of a man who had lost everything, still lunged after her, his face stripped of all reason, and Cora understood that this time he hadn't come to threaten or humiliate her the way he had that night in the restaurant. This time, he had come intending to end everything. She tripped on the curb and collapsed to her knees, and when she looked up, she saw him coming closer, the knife raised, and in a moment that stretched out as though it would never end, she thought that perhaps this was the ending fate had marked out for her from the beginning. That all these past months, Wesley's kindness, the fragile hope just beginning to bloom, had only been a brief dream before the familiar darkness swallowed her whole. But just then, from behind them, a young, panicked voice cried out her name, and Cora recognized Presley, the kitchen assistant, who had been worried about her and had stayed late that night to walk with her to the subway. He was running toward them with all the strength he had, and in that split second, everything seemed to slow before shattering into chaos. Presley rushed forward at the exact moment the knife came down, and he didn't hesitate for even a second. He threw himself between Cora and Thad, using his own body as a shield to protect her, and Cora heard a pained gasp break out of him as the blade grazed him. Then he staggered and collapsed beside her, one hand clutching his bleeding upper arm, but still trying to force himself back up to stand in front of her. And in the young kitchen assistant's eyes there was no longer the helplessness from that first night, only a trembling yet steady resolve. The resolve of someone who had finally dared to step forward. The sight of Presley bleeding because of her tore a scream from Cora's throat, and in that same instant, tires shrieked against the road as several black cars rushed in and blocked the street. The car doors flew open, and Wesley jumped out before the vehicles had even fully stopped, followed by Rowan and his men. And Cora realized that even though she hadn't called, he had still kept people silently watching over her from a distance throughout these past weeks, and that was exactly what had saved her life. Everything happened within only a few seconds. Wesley's men surged forward and slammed Thad down onto the road, the knife flying from his hand and skidding across the stone pavement. And when Wesley stepped forward and stood towering over the man lying on the ground, Cora saw his face and went cold, because it was no longer the calm face she knew. It was something dark and primal, the fury of a man who had just nearly lost the only precious thing he had found in his entire life. Rowan silently drew a gun and placed it in Wesley's hand without a word, as though this was simply what had to happen, and Wesley took it, aiming it down at Thad as he curled on the ground and stammered for mercy. And in that moment the whole street seemed to hold its breath. Cora understood that he truly would do it, that he would end this man right here so he could never touch her again. But Cora, even with one arm still supporting Presley as he bled, forced herself to stand and stagger forward, throwing herself directly between Wesley's weapon and the trembling man on the ground, shielding Thad with her own body as she looked up into Wesley's eyes. And this time her voice no longer trembled, but broke open through tears. She begged him not to do this. And when he didn't move, his eyes still fixed on Thad, she went on speaking words that came from the deepest place inside her, saying that if he pulled the trigger, the contemptible man lying on the ground would win, because he would turn Wesley into the very thing he had spent his whole life fearing he would become. She said she wasn't begging for Thad's life, that he wasn't worth a single tear from her, that she was begging for Wesley himself, that she didn't want the man who had stepped forward for her when the whole world looked away to stain his hands with the blood of someone so pathetic, that the 7-year-old boy from the gas station hadn't built everything he had only to turn himself, with his own hands, into the monster he had once feared. She told him he was stronger than this anger, that lowering the gun was harder and braver than pulling the trigger, that she believed he could choose the light, even if only this once, and she begged him to let the law punish him, to let those other women have their day to speak, and to let Wesley be free from the cycle of violence that had imprisoned both of them their whole lives. Wesley stood there, the gun trembling in his hand, and Cora saw the fierce battle taking place inside him in every line of his face. Then, very slowly, as though he were setting down a weight that had pressed on him for decades, he lowered the gun. And when he turned to look at her, those eyes that had once been cold as ice were bright with tears for the first time. And in that moment, in the empty street beneath the yellow light, the man who had once made all of Boston afraid chose to let go of the darkness, not because anyone forced him to, but because of the love of a person who had seen the human part of him still left alive. Many months later, on a spring morning when the first sunlight spilled gold across the stone steps of the Boston courthouse, Cora walked into the courtroom with a feeling that was both unfamiliar and steady, because this was the first time in her life she was standing to face Thad, not in a dark alley or a cramped apartment, but in a place with law, with light, with people willing to listen. The attack on her that night, with Presley and Wesley's men as witnesses, along with the wound on the young kitchen assistant's arm, had made every attempt by the defense attorney to deny guilt meaningless. But what truly changed the course of the trial was the one thing Thad had never expected, that she didn't step onto the witness stand alone. During the month spent preparing for the trial, Rowan had quietly found all 3 women from Thad's past, and instead of being bought into silence the way that old complaint had once been erased, this time they were given something they had never had before, the assurance that if they spoke up, someone would stand behind them. And one by one, they chose to step out of the darkness. Cora sat in the courtroom and listened as the first woman told the story of her years in a trembling voice, then the second, then the third, and every testimony was like another brick being set into place, building a wall of truth that no clever attorney could tear down. And when it was her turn, Cora stood, looked straight at Thad where he sat hunched in the defendant's chair, and this time she felt no fear. She told her story calmly and clearly, without exaggerating and without turning away from anything. From the childhood years lived in fear, to the night he came to the restaurant, to the knife in the dark alley, and as she spoke, she could feel the eyes of the 3 women watching her from the benches below, the compassionate eyes of people who had walked through the same pain, and for the first time in her life, she truly understood that she wasn't alone. When the judge delivered the verdict, finding Thad guilty on all charges, and handing down a sentence long enough that he would never again be able to hurt another woman, the entire courtroom fell silent for a moment, and then Cora heard the soft sob of one of the 3 women, not a cry of pain, but the cry of a burden carried for many years finally being set down. Thad was led away, and this time he didn't shout or threaten anymore. He only lowered his head, a man completely stripped of the false power he had once used to imprison so many lives. And as Cora watched his shadow disappear behind the door, she realized there was no satisfaction in her heart, only a deep relief, the feeling of someone who had just set down something she had carried on her shoulders for far too long. As they stepped out of the courtroom, the 4 women who had once been victims of the same man paused together in the sunlit hallway, and though they had been strangers before, there was now a thread between them that only those who had survived the same darkness could understand. They held one another's hands, gave one another small nods, and in that simple moment, Cora understood that true justice wasn't only in the sentence the court had just pronounced, but also in the truth that not one of them would ever have to stand alone again. That spring, a few months after the trial, Wesley did something that left even the people closest to him stunned. He quietly used part of his enormous fortune to establish a support foundation for women who had survived abuse, a place that provided safe housing, legal counseling, and financial assistance for those who had no one to lean on. And he placed the foundation's first office right in the North End, only a few steps from Il Faro, with the 3 women from Thad's past becoming the first people it helped, and then choosing to stay and work there themselves so they could guide those who came after them. Cora understood that one charitable foundation couldn't erase everything Wesley had done in the past, that a person couldn't shed an entire lifetime in a single night, and Wesley himself never once pretended he had become a saint. But she saw in him a sincere beginning, a man learning day by day how to use his power to heal instead of spreading fear, and to her, that was worth more than any kind of perfection. One Thursday evening, when the restaurant had thinned out and candlelight once again washed the familiar room in gold, Cora brought a bottle of red wine to table number 6, where Wesley sat waiting. But this time she didn't pour for him and turn away. She set 2 glasses on the table, poured one for him and one for herself, then sat down in the chair across from him as an equal, not as a server. Wesley looked at her for a long time, then said he knew he wasn't an easy man to love, that he carried too much darkness, and that his past would always be part of who he was. And then, for the first time in his life, the man who had never had to beg for anything quietly said he wasn't asking her to forgive what he had once been. He was only asking her to give him a chance to become a better man each day beside her. Cora smiled. That warm smile no one had ever been able to take from her after all those years, then placed her hand over his, not to stop him as she had twice before, but to hold it, and she told him she had known her answer to his choice for a long time. She said she chose to stay, not because she needed him to protect her, but because she believed in the person he was trying to become, and because sometimes the bravest thing a person could do wasn't to run away from the darkness, but to stay and walk toward the light together. Cora and Wesley's story leaves us with a profound lesson, that a person's dignity is never decided by power or money, but by how they choose to treat those weaker than themselves, that a kindness which seems small can still have the power to soften even the most hardened hearts, and that no one, no matter how wounded they are, has to walk through their pain alone, because sometimes all it takes is one person willing to step forward when the whole world turns away to change an entire life. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share this video so that together, every day, we can listen to many more meaningful and compelling stories. We would truly love to know how you feel about this story. Do you see a reflection of real life out there within it? Have you ever witnessed or personally stepped forward to protect someone when the people around you chose to stay silent? Please leave a comment and share the feelings from the bottom of your heart, because we always treasure every story and every emotion you share with us. Thank you for spending your time listening all the way to these final moments. We wish you and your loved ones abundant health, a joyful life, peace, and serenity every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next videos.